It's my pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. I want to begin my presentation by thanking people living with HIV and viral hepatitis who've generously shared their time, experience, and often their bodies for research in all its forms, including informing the content of my presentation today. Much of the fight against HIV/AIDS and viral hepatitis relies upon people living with these conditions, putting themselves forward to improve treatments, and our continued fight is indebted to those both past and present. When we're talking about equity of access, I'm going to assume for this presentation, this is about access to treatments. But I also wanted to think about and encourage you to think about what else is important to ensure the access to treatments. And, to begin with, there's some obvious things that influence treatment access. There's your geography, your gender, your health systems that are available, the stock, obviously, the prescriber or clinicians available to assist in getting treatments, and of course, the perennial costs involved in treatments as well. But in terms of the equity of access I want to speak to you about this afternoon, I want to talk about what is the equity of access to information. What is the effect of an enabling environment on ensuring that treatment access is maximized? And in particular, I want to talk about the role of peers to ensure that information is relayed that mirrors the advice that we get from our clinical colleagues in a context, though, that is accessible and meaningful. In this, what I'm going to problematize is the difference between what I'd call treatment preparedness and treatment readiness, the difference and why both are important. So in terms of preparedness, this can be best described as getting things in order. This is making your doctor's appointments. These are about getting your baseline tests done. This is getting your script. It's about getting your pharmacy located, all of which are incredibly important. Whereas readiness is really about being willing to do so, getting your mindset locked in. This is about the limitations of your treatments, what expectations you have and what you don't have, your contingency plans that may be made, if you have to travel, everything else. And of course, it may sound trite, but it is incredibly important to people who have to take treatments all the time. The very real things like, where am I going to store these? Am I going to put them by my coffee machine, or am I going to put them on my bedside stand? Am I going to get a dosette box? If I'm going to get a dosette box, what's the best dosette box for me? And all of these things are incredibly important about being willing to do so. Getting the first point is my major point, that your mindset locked in. And typically, if we were to think about this linearly, readiness follows preparedness. But I'd like us to think about the fact that preparedness and readiness should happen simultaneously. But in many cases, readiness is the domain of the clinician, and many great clinicians also assist with readiness. I want to absolutely say that's the case. But the motivation required to get ready for something, to check in again and again, is something that's not conducive to a crowded clinical schedule. Our 8-minute consultations don't allow someone to constantly check in with their clinician on every little question they may have. And this is where the peers come in. This is where things like the Institute of Many, which is a virtual online group of people living with HIV, where people can test their senses of, this might work for me, does it work for you? And get that feedback information. There are things that are real time, such as Phoenix. Phoenix is a program that's developed for people who are newly diagnosed with HIV in Australia. Well, in Victoria, it's called Phoenix. It's called different programs elsewhere, but they're exactly the same program. And they get you ready for the sense to go. And this is where your identity and your acceptance shifts. And ideally, as my little lines there are trying to demonstrate, they mutually reinforce each other. As my identity shifts, as my acceptance shifts, my preparedness and readiness shifts. At this point, I really want to say this is not about preferencing one over the other. Please don't walk away from this presentation with any sense that I'm saying preparedness is better than readiness, or that preparedness is solely the aspect of a clinician and readiness is for peers. What I'm trying to say here is that it mutually reinforces, but it helps us understand when we understand the differences involved. And that being said, I now jump to the other side and say that, unfortunately, readiness is often under-resourced, and that the role of peer influencers is discounted as something that is either soft and fluffy or nice, but not necessary. It's kind of like the add-on, but not integral. And one of the things I want to source here is we did a study of HIV-positive people in Victoria using Deacon's health literacy scale. And the one thing we found across all of the different archetypes that we created was the social support for health was low, regardless of your income, regardless of your socioeconomic backgrounds, it was regardless of your ethnicity. The social support for health, which we know is essential for good health literacy, was low and lacking in all of those archetypes. So I guess my position and my challenge to you is, how can we increase peers to assist the roles of clinicians? Not to overtake, but to assist and enable. And we were asked to think about 3 different questions when we came here to speak. The first was, how can we ensure equity of access for all people at risk of infected by HIV, hepatitis B, or hep C? And I want to start by saying we need to make information accessible in all formats that are meaningful, in contexts whose those at risk or infected can engage critically with the information. This requires trusted sources in different spaces, reinforcing the same message over time. This is probably one of my most favorite campaigns. It comes from Harm Reduction Victoria. It's the hashtag Treat Me campaign. This is targeting people who are injection drug users, simple literacy, infographics. These are exactly the same messages that are being given by your clinicians, given to people who, in a different way, different format, mutually reinforcing. The second question, and this is my new trial of this, so hopefully none of you have heard me say this before, because usually I just regurgitate the same old thing again and again. We were asked to reflect on what are some new innovative approaches to achieve targets in increasingly constrained funding environments. And I want to strongly advocate for the placement of liaison officers or treatment officers in GP surgeries. This is in an in-house referral system where peers can extend the clinical consult with aspects of readiness and peer-supported referrals to community services. I was recently talking to my clinician about this, what he thought of this, and he's like, oh, you have no idea how much I would value that. He's like, I get patients and they are desperate to talk about things, but I have got to get them out of my room. I'm already 45 minutes behind my schedule. And if I had something where I could just say, you know what, right now, I'm just gonna make you a referral in-house to the liaison officer. He's down the hall. I think you should see him now, or I'm gonna make a meeting for you next week. That simple. Let's cut out the clicks so you don't have to go find people. And finally, what are some of the key barriers to achieving universal access to harm reduction, testing, care, and treatment vaccines, and how can they be addressed to ensure successful evidence-based approaches can be integrated to public health policies and practices? And there are some of which I've addressed in this presentation for you, and I'm sure others will address as we continue on down the line. But I can't but help pulling out social stigma. Social stigma associated with hepatitis C and B and HIV is pernicious, and it's a debilitating force which causes communities to value one life more than another. It creates a fear of testing, as Edwina has said, and it dissuades people from accessing treatments. Public health policy and practice in viral hepatitis and HIV must acknowledge, respond, and tackle stigma as a priority if we're to expect to achieve the targets we set for ourselves. I so love it when Edwina goes before me because I can just bounce back and it's like we planned this or something. We didn't. And finally, just so that you have the information, Harm Reduction Victoria's treatment campaign can be found here. It can be downloaded for free, all of those images. And I encourage you to also go to Living Positive Victoria's Enough campaign. More than 3,500 people from around the world have signed up to become an advocate and a champion against HIV stigma. You do say you have to take a pledge. You can do it in the privacy of your own home, but you do sign up to become a champion against stigma. Thank you.